Thank you, Owl. All right, thank you everybody for coming. My name is Laura Graziano. I'm the Assistant County Planner and GIS Coordinator here at Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission.
I'm Katie Simmons. I'm the Climate Resiliency and Planning intern here.
My name is Emily Ravi. I'm the County Planner here at Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission.
And I'm Jessica Brunacini.
Right, we'll pass it off to Katie for an introduction.
Okay, so like I said, I'm Katie. We're incredibly excited to welcome all of you in person and on Zoom to Interprets Live, our climate-based conversation. For those of you who don't know, this is essentially a live version of our newsletter that we send out every month entitled Interprets. It goes out to over 700 Lincoln County residents each month. It began in 2021 following the release of Maine Won't Wait, a 4-year climate plan. And the goal was to provide easily digestible summaries of the strategies that were presented in the plan. It returned in 2022 featuring different climate change topics and their effects on humans and the environment. And new to our 2022 edition was a segment entitled Climate Change in You, which showcased behaviors that individuals could take to address climate change. This year, in 2023, Interpret dives into climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. Some examples from this year so far are rain barrels, living shorelines, and bioretention. And our next edition is coming out Friday, so stay tuned. And Interprets has been incredibly well received by the community. So as a way to foster even more community engagement, we decided to bring it live right here, right now. Tonight, we're excited to have Dr. Jessica Brunacini here to discuss social vulnerability and social resilience as a climate adaptation tool. She works extensively in Maine, supporting coastal communities as they plan for and respond to the impacts of climate change. And she'll be presenting on these topics, but the goal is to make this a conversation. We want to hear from you all, so we'll be taking questions, comments, concerns, etc. throughout the night. I'll let her introduce herself and her topics soon, but first we're going to hear from Laura with a little intro on mitigation and adaptation strategies, which is the main topic of 2023 Interprets.
Great, thanks, Katie. So starting with climate adaptation can be described as the process of adjusting to avoid the expected or actual consequences of climate change and reduce vulnerability. This can include altering our behaviors, systems, and in some cases, our way of life to protect our environment. Adaptation is a form of risk management and involves managing both short and long-term risks. Integrating climate risk management into existing design, planning, and operations, in contrast to adding novel decision processes for climate adaptation alone, can provide many adaptation benefits. Then climate mitigation actions reduce the rate of climate change through strategies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance greenhouse gas storages. These interventions are taken to reduce the severity of impacts from the changing climate. The way we develop our communities has significant impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, so it's important to plan with that in mind. So when you're looking at adaptation and mitigation, adaptation addresses the impacts of climate change as well as the actions to reduce vulnerability to climate change, and mitigation attends to the causes of climate change and actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you provide some examples of each of those?
Yeah, so some examples of climate adaptation that we can see are land use changes, restoring natural areas, upgrading infrastructure like culverts and roads, preparing for sea level rise and flooding events. And then some mitigation examples include renewable energy, enhancing carpet sinks like wetlands and marshes, waste management like composting, sustainable transportation, which could include walking and biking when you're able to and it's safe.
Okay, and in what ways do those two overlap, or do they?
Yeah, so they do kind of go hand in hand, the two. For example, by restoring your natural areas, you are also enhancing your carbon sinks. So the two really do go hand in hand throughout their different strategies.
Okay, and I have one more. Would you say adaptation or mitigation is more important or more effective than the other?
Yeah, they're equally important. And they overlap in a lot of different ways. And some of the ways that they overlap include public engagement, education, locally sourced food, weatherization of buildings, and green infrastructure.
That's all I have. Does anyone else have any questions?
Great.
The greenhouse storage, what's happening with that?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay, I'll start and you guys can build off.
We can get to it later. What?
No, not a problem. Yeah, so with things like wetlands and trees, they soak up the carbon and absorb the carbon. And when we have larger and better natural areas, they're able to hold the carbon as like a carbon sink. I don't know if Jess would like to expand on that a bit.
Well, I would just say that adaptation is more of my area of expertise, but I know that there's a lot of work going on in Maine right now to look at, is it the blue, what is the blue? There's like the blue economy or the blue ocean strategy. To kind of better understand the ways in which the ocean and various aspects of the ocean could potentially be part of a strategy to reduce emissions, because they are natural carbon sinks. We are, as they start to warm up, we are losing some of that ability to do that. But there are some other really wild strategies about like sucking stuff out of the atmosphere and storing it underground or storing it in rocks. But some of that is very, very, very expensive and untested. So we have a long way to go on kind of figuring out those strategies.
And composting, is that happening by community?
Yeah, it does happen at the community levels. I know the county takes compost at their composting facility, and it also goes at, people at home compost as well. But at the county level, we do have that food scrap drop-offs available.
So is that getting publicized and out to the public?
And it's on the county website. I'm not sure how much involvement there is on our end. I know there was a big push for when it started, and the kind of excitement for it seemed to drop off after a bit. So it was successful. I don't know if Carrie has more to say about that, our county administrator.
Sure, I can share information on the composting program. We compost food scraps that are collected at various transfer stations and that are dropped off directly at our recycling center. We combine that with yard waste, leaves, and local horse manure. We don't generally advertise it because when we do, we have a run on compost that people want to purchase, and then we run out and people get angry because they make special trips to buy it. So it's kind of a word of mouth thing, and we sell out of everything that we make.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we dig into resilience and risk and vulnerability? All right, well, I will give you a brief introduction of who I am and where I'm from and what I do. So I am Jessica Brunacini. I am a coastal resilience specialist with Maine Sea Grant and with the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. This is a job that I have been in for just about 5 or so months. Prior to that, I was completing my dissertation, working with the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve down in Wells, to explore the social dimensions of climate change adaptation. So thinking about how communities are experiencing and responding to the impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion and increased storm surge. And kind of one of the things that I was looking at was how people are attached to place and what makes place special for them, and how does that inform the way that they are observing change over time and the way that they're thinking about risk for the future, and how it informs the way that we respond to those impacts. My dissertation was from Michigan State University, so I moved to Maine in October of 2020, so I've been here for about 2.5 years, but I should just state that I am from away because I know that is that is a big deal. I'm originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, so quite a different landscape. We don't have a lot of coasts there, so it's not an area where much of my work can kind of be applied, but it does kind of inform the way that I think about climate change, because I am very attached to that place, and it is changing very rapidly, and it informs the way that I think about the work that I do. So I think we'll get the slides up and going. And I'm excited to chat with you tonight to have a conversation about social resilience and social vulnerability, broadly speaking. I have included this word cloud here to give you a sense of how complex these issues are, or these concepts are. So I studied a bit about resilience during my dissertation, and I've been working as a resilience practitioner for a while now. And even I get completely overwhelmed by the number of different topics and concepts and interconnectivity between all of them. So that is just to say that I'm hoping that tonight I can give you kind of a synthesized, concise overview of these issues. But if you have questions along the way, please ask me. I hope that I don't come off as too academic. If you're like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. Please just raise your hand or shout out on Zoom or shout out in the room and say, Jessica, you gotta bring it down a notch. So with that can I press it? Do I just do, yeah, maybe? Okay, great. So the topic of resilience, it is something that a lot of us are thinking about, we're working on, we're talking about, we're having conversations about. Resilience for me has become a little bit difficult because I think that it has really become a buzzword. And when things start to become a buzzword, we start to lose the meaning of what we're actually doing and what we're actually talking about. So I always think that it's important to kind of go back to what is the definition, and can we create a shared language around these terms that we're using? You know, if we're talking about building resilience, do we all have the same type of resilient future in mind? If not, then we're going to be working at cross purposes. So in the interest of kind of creating a shared understanding of what resilience is, I'd actually love to ask all of you, online and in person, when you see or hear this word, what comes to mind? What does it make you think of? What are the types of qualities that you might associate with resilience? Either at a personal level, a community level, a country level, anything. What does resilience bring to mind for you? Oh, I don't know if we can see.
I'm watching.
Oh, great.
So far, no one's raised their hand.
Perfect. Don't be shy.
I just think like a general definition thingy, like the capacity to persist despite obstacles.
Yeah, that's great. That was a very good definition. So the capacity to persist despite obstacles, right? Okay. What else?
When I think about resilience, I think about like what I want to persist,
Okay.
and especially when I think about like culture and climate change, and that it's I think about, like our fisheries or something like that. Do I want a resilient lobstering community that can continue, is like resilience in the ability, like what persists is specifically lobstering, or is it that like I have working waterfronts in our community and that's what I want to persist, and that like that's not the lobstering that I'm tied to, but just careers related to our waterfronts or things like that. So I think that's where I think it's important to define in resilience what you're hoping to have persist.
Yeah, definitely. So being specific about what we're talking about when we say, resilience of what or resilient to what, like what is it actually that we're talking about when we want something to be resilient? Anybody else? Anybody on the panel?
Anyone on Zoom? Oh, it looks like someone had just unmuted themselves by accident.
Okay.
I think like overall, I think of just like a strong and safe community. When you think of resilience, like bringing it back to just the word resilience, strong and safe, like having everybody. Yeah.
Great. So I was happy, Laura, that you provided some definitions, because I am very much a definition person. I think it's important to have a definition to go back to. to, if we're talking about building resilience, how do we actually know that we're doing it unless we have something to go back to? So I've included here the definition of resilience from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they define resilience as, it's a long definition, so I've kind of broken it up into different sections, but they define resilience as the capacity of a system. It could be a social, an economic, or an environmental, or combined, right? A social ecological system, to cope with a hazardous event or a trend or a disturbance. We can think of climate change as one of those. Those systems are responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity, and structure, which I think actually speaks to your point about, is it the lobster or is it kind of the working waterfront? And is it the identity that Maine has as kind of a place where working waterfronts are really thriving? While also, this is the reason that I like this description, is while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, for learning, and for transformation. So it's not static. Resilience is something that goes on and is kind of a systematic, iterative process. And Katie, I think you'll be happy to see this, because when I think about resilience, resilience exists in a bunch of different systems. It is tied with engineering, and that's one of the reasons that we have this idea about bouncing back. So if we engineer something to absorb a shock, it's going to bounce back, and that means that it's resilient. But when we're talking about social resilience and potentially social ecological resilience, we don't want to just think about bouncing back. We want to think about bouncing forward, because sometimes resilience is not always an inherently positive thing. There are some systems that are resilient, that are negative, right? Like poverty is a very resilient system. If we have, for example, a community or a neighborhood or an individual or family or whatever that is living in poverty and they are impacted by a shock, like a storm or a flood, if we want them to bounce back, they're bouncing back to an inherently unsafe, kind of unsustainable place, right? They're bouncing back to poverty. If we're talking about real resilience and moving forward, we want to move people out of poverty in response to these shocks so that they are actually moving forward and not just bouncing back to the status quo. So this is a very complicated graphic, but I think that it kind of, it speaks a bit to the bouncing forward, right? If you look at the circles that are concentric, you can kind of see the direction of the arrows. When we're talking about resilience, we're talking about coping with stress or with shocks, or we're talking about adapting to them, or we're potentially talking about transforming in response to those shocks. So I was trying to think of some examples on the way here. And again, going back to like a storm or a severe flood, or a hurricane or something like that, and we have communities who are really impacted, we have roads washed out, we have people who are cut off. If we're thinking about coping, what we're thinking about is responding to people's immediate needs, right? We're thinking about getting them the supplies that they need. We're thinking about getting them from their home to the hospital if they need to be. That's coping with a stress. If we're thinking about adaptive capacity, we might be thinking about what can we do in the future to prevent some of this from happening. And so if we're talking about flooded roads, we might think about raising the road or building a better culvert so that we are actually adapting to the changes that are happening. But if we're thinking about transformative capacity or transformative response to shocks, we might actually be thinking about, is this road and is this community that is in this very risky place something that we should keep there? Or should we be moving people to a more safe and secure place? So we are fundamentally thinking about drastically changing kind of the environment. And so this is all just to say that there's the big R kind of resilience, and then there's also social resilience. So when we think about social resilience in people, we're thinking about, we're thinking about factors such as a community's level of social cohesion, their social capital, the networks that they have, the relationships that they have between each other, or their social infrastructure, right? We talk a lot about built infrastructure, we're talking about roads, bridges, et cetera. Social infrastructure is really important for protecting people in times of stress or shock, because it's the type of network that gets activated in response to people's needs. So it's those types of aspects that can kind of help people to effectively prepare, respond, adapt, or transform in response to stressors or shocks, including climate change. So back to this question of resilience to what is it that we're trying to be resilient to or against, and for whom? Who are we trying to build the resilience of? So when we're talking about climate change, we're really talking about increased risk. That is what we're trying to be resilient to, right? We're rolling the dice, and the dice is getting higher and higher. Statistically, we're heading into a space where impacts are becoming increasingly more severe. And so risk is comprised of these 4 different dimensions. It's comprised of hazards, exposure, vulnerabilities, and also the responses that we take to those risk events. So when we're thinking about hazards, if we go back to the community or the road that is adjacent to an area that's going to be flooded, it's right on the coast. The hazard is actually the flood event. It's the storm, it's the sea level rise, etc. The exposure is the fact that people are living in those places, so they are exposed to that hazard. The vulnerability is the type of sensitivities that they have that make them more likely to be impacted. And then the responses, of course, will affect the way that that we experience risk, in that it'll either reduce risk, or in some cases, if we're not choosing very carefully, we might do things that further increase our risk. So I pulled this graphic from a public health article, and I thought that it was really nice because it kind of compares the different types of hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities that that we see in different types of shocks, right? So COVID-19 was a shock to our system, in the same way that climate change is shaping up to be, is already for some people. So the reason that I liked this was that I think, we all experienced COVID-19. We lived through the experience of it shocking the system. And so in some ways, I think that the examples that it gives help to make some of these pretty abstract and academic concepts a little more tangible. So if we're talking about a hazard, so for COVID-19, one of the hazards was the virus itself, right? We had the variants of concern that came out, at different points throughout the pandemic. And then we also had population mobility, and that's a hazard because as people were traveling, they were exposing new populations to this disease and transmitting it to other people. The exposure for COVID-19 is affected by things like, this is very small, crowding, right? So we saw a lot of people that were living in big cities actually fleeing them because they knew that they were more exposed to that risk. Things like their healthcare settings is one area, obviously, where we see exposure to COVID-19, and occupational setting. As we can all remember, doctors and nurses were being exposed to this disease. And then for vulnerability for COVID-19, things like age, sex, pre-existing medical conditions, and folks who were disadvantaged were the people who were more vulnerable to the risk of COVID-19. So I thought that this was useful in a way because it does give us some more of those tangible and personally memorable kind of concepts, bringing them down to the ground. So social vulnerability refers to certain conditions or circumstances that affect an individual or community's capacity to anticipate, to confront, to repair, and or to recover from the effects of a shock or a stress like climate change or disasters. So I wanted to stop again and engage with you all to ask, when you think about social vulnerability in your own community, in your family, in your, in your neighborhood, et cetera, in your workplace, what comes to mind? Like, what are the types of either characteristics or circumstances that come to mind that might make people more vulnerable to the impacts of a stress like climate change?
Let's go for selective ignorance.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Selective ignorance or willful ignorance of the problem.
Ah, interesting. So How do you think that would make people more vulnerable?
Just lacking any initiative to see the problems that are ultimately addressable.
I see. That is a really interesting one. That's not one that I thought about, but I can see where you're going in that if
No
you,
politics were included there.
yes, I completely agree. If you don't have, let's say, the information that you need, right, to make a decision or to protect yourself, then you might be making yourself more vulnerable. What else? What other types of characteristics or circumstances might make people vulnerable to, let's say, sea level rise or drought or heat events?
So we had a Zoom attendee right in the chat, economically disadvantaged to prepare or recover from a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Economically disadvantaged, right. Responding to disaster requires resources, right? Oftentimes money. So people who are economically disadvantaged might not have the resources necessary to respond. That makes them more vulnerable. Anything else from any of you?
Location, like being in such a rural area, people, you know, up in Somerville, down on some dirt roads for emergency services to even get there could be
Yeah.
a problem.
Absolutely. Yes, and we have a lot of small rural geographically dispersed communities in Maine. So that is an important, a very important kind of indicator. So I think I'm going to, for the interest of time, skip this screen, but this is just to say that in a place like Maine, there is a lot of work that has been done on social vulnerability, and it's been done by people like the Centers for Disease Control. It's been done by people like the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Environmental Protection Agency, which is what you see here. They developed a geographic web-based tool for exploring environmental justice communities, right? And some of the indicators of environmental justice communities are things like people of color, your age, your income, you know, your level of education, whether or not you speak English, etc. The thing is that these tools are great starting places. They depend on quantitative data, usually on census data, and they're based on, you know, a map, right? In Maine, a lot of the people who we might consider vulnerable are geographically dispersed. So the reason that I had wanted to pull this up is when you turn this map on and you turn on really most of these indicators, hardly anything pops up in Maine. But I think we would all agree that like that is not telling the full story of who is vulnerable. If we're using these screening tools, if we're only using these screening tools to understand who is socially vulnerable in a place like Maine, we are really missing out on a big part of the story. So there's a group of folks who have been working on this issue of social vulnerability for several years now, and what they did is they took the kind of the different indicators that the Centers for Disease Control had put together as, you know, these are the kind of markers of social vulnerability. They looked at the list and they identified a handful more indicators to include that reflect more of the context in Maine. So you'll see on here, the ones that are marked with a little asterisk are the ones that were added by Eileen Johnson, Liz Hertz, and Jeremy Bell to create this Maine Social Vulnerability Index. So, you know, some of the things that you see here are the different kind of categories of vulnerability are the socioeconomic status, which is exactly what someone on Zoom had just said about, you know, the level of income or the economically disadvantaged groups. You've got that household composition and also disability. Again, so people who are over 65 in Maine, we have a lot of people who are over 65 and who are living alone. So if we're talking about things like when roads are cut off by flooding or by, you know, strong storm surges, we have a lot of people who might be left kind of stranded and who don't have a support system within their household to help them. Then we also have, you know, the minority status and language. So if you're part of a minority population, or if you speak English less than well, sometimes that will matter when we're thinking about emergency response, right? If it's not in a language other than English, then people might be left behind. And then housing and transportation. So the type of housing structures that you live in will also impact your vulnerability. So mobile homes is a big one. Mobile or manufactured homes is a big one because they oftentimes, while people will own the physical building, they may not own the land underneath it. And so that puts them in kind of a tenuous position, particularly if there's storm damage. And then things like not having a vehicle obviously will make people more socially vulnerable if they live in a place where there is not public transportation, which a lot of Maine, that covers a lot of Maine. I'm just going to stop real quick and ask if there are any questions, because I know that I'm like blasting you with a ton of information.
Anyone on Zoom like to ask a question?
My mentor always says, give it 14 seconds, which feels really uncomfortable, but, but you know, give people time. So feel free to interrupt at any point. So getting back to this idea of risk and the components that make up risk, the hazards, the exposure, and the vulnerability. The way that we respond to this risk and the way that we address things like hazards, exposure, and vulnerability is part of the pathway to becoming resilient, right? So if we're talking about the hazards in terms of climate change, we might be talking about things like mitigation, right? Exactly what you were talking about, because some of the hazards are things like heat waves or flooding, and those are driven by the increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if we're doing mitigation behaviors, we are trying to reduce some of those hazards. The exposure component, if we're thinking about sea level rise and storm surge and coastal erosion, we might think about zoning as an option for decreasing people's exposure and saying, in these areas that are becoming increasingly risky, we will no longer develop. So that we're not actually exposing people to that risk. And then for vulnerability, we can't engineer our way out of vulnerability. We can raise the roads, we can build better culverts, we can implement nature-based solutions, but ultimately when we're addressing vulnerability, we have to address the underlying drivers of vulnerability. Social vulnerability is not an inherent quality necessarily that people are born with. Social vulnerability oftentimes is a result of systems in which the US and other countries operate, right? So people of color are not born inherently vulnerable. They are made to be vulnerable by the systems that we have in place. So sometimes when we're talking about addressing social vulnerability, we have to really think much bigger and much more holistically about what we're doing to reduce people's vulnerability. So vulnerability and resilience are not the opposite of each other. They are interrelated, but one of the areas where they intersect is this concept of adaptive capacity. So it's the ability, including the resources, that people need in order to anticipate the impacts, to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities that might come up as a result of climate change, and or to respond to the consequences or the impact. So in the space where resilience and vulnerability are kind of meeting, it is to help build people's adaptive capacities, individuals, communities, towns, regions, counties, etc. So one of the ways to do that is to do that work that helps to mitigate the hazard, to reduce the exposure, and to address those underlying drivers of vulnerability. And it's really through that process of doing this work to build adaptive capacity that, that's because I'm going the wrong way, that we are working to actually build resilience. And I think that is all that I have. So I would love any questions or comments or ideas or criticisms that you might have.
I wanted to add something really quick when you were talking about responses and zoning and whatnot. This doesn't really have to do with Maine, but I was listening to a podcast the other day that in California, State Farm and Allstate insurances are not going to insure houses out there anymore due to climate change and wildfires because it's just too expensive for them. So I thought that was just a really interesting approach that businesses are starting to look
Yeah.
at this, not just scientists.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just at a conference about managed retreat, which is moving people, property, infrastructure out of harm's way. And there's a lot of people talking about incentive programs and buyout programs to actually buy people's homes as they become more risky. But there was a lot of conversation about there's this other kind of market pressure that's happening because insurance companies and also reinsurance companies. So insurance companies have people who insure them. And both the insurance and the reinsurance companies are starting to really back off of these areas that are very risky because they just can't afford to keep paying out all of the damages, especially as they increase because of whether it's sea level rise or wildfires or drought. So yeah, that is going to be interesting to see how that starts to unfold in other places, for sure.
You can add the federal flood insurance program to that
Yes,
matrix.
yes. Yeah.
Especially the 2.0 scheme,
Mm-hmm.
which we've not felt it severely here yet, but places that are overtly more vulnerable certainly have. And if you just look at the algorithm and the policy, the curve looks like this for what people are going to have to be paying for coverage, and that's not a sustainable curve.
Yes, the National Flood Insurance Program is also one of those programs that it offers flood insurance for communities who are living in floodplains. And as FEMA has been updating its maps, exactly like you're talking about, it has meant that flood insurance is increasing pretty rapidly for folks, including in Maine. There are some folks in southern Maine who are really unhappy with the updated maps. But the other thing to point out is that the FEMA maps don't actually include any type of future projection of change. They are all based on historical impacts. So right there, you can see that we're also in a point where that probably needs to change.
We escaped some of the valuation changes that were attached to Sandy because we were sort of left off the end of it, both for funding subsequent to the event and how folks looked at our conditions. But with warming waters, Sandy could very well be an event impacting much more the southern Maine coast than it did in the actual Sandy a few years ago.
Yeah. Right, which speaks to, what is our adaptive capacity in Maine? What are we doing to prepare for the things that we think might be coming or that we know are coming? And that's one of the great things, and they did not pay me to say this, but one of the great things that Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission is doing is participating in these projects and these programs that really are actively working with municipalities to help them look at the data. What is the data saying? What is your local knowledge and experience on the ground saying? And how do we prepare for what is projected to come to Maine?
It isn't so bad on the Rocky Coast, but
True.
South of Portland, it isn't a good picture, and there needs to be probably state and federal money thrown at that problem.
Yeah, and there actually is. There is a ton of money coming from both a federal and a state level at this point to address these very issues. So
has it gone as far as buyouts?
As far as I know, that is not really on the table in Maine. It is on the table in places like New Hampshire for some of the communities that live in the estuary area. They are considering a buyout program.
their situation is not that different from the low-lying beach areas in southern Maine.
Yeah. I don't disagree.
I have a question specifically about sea level rise.
Yeah.
Do you know of any specific communication that any municipalities in this region have, done any outreach to people living on the coast there about how their homes may be impacted by sea level rise? And then do you have an idea of what the most effective form of communication about those risks may be?
As far as the municipalities reaching out individually, I haven't heard anything. I think there are more communities that are starting to enroll in the state's community resilience partnership, and they are forming climate action committees that are looking at this, but I don't know how far they've gotten yet in terms of public outreach, education, and things like that, at least on the municipal scale. I think the state of Maine is trying to do that in a sense with, these education opportunities. I know through the Resilience Partnership, the Region 1 coordinators are doing, and across the state are doing like what do they call it? Building Stronger Communities, educational webinars. I think they're like once a month on a different topic tied to climate and climate adaptation resiliency. Even at our level, this is why we're doing this today, is to promote and, build a education around this so people can kind of understand it and understand what it means. But so that's kind of a long answer is no, we haven't heard anything at the local level.
I do know, I was part of a project that was, it was the Tides, Taxes, and New Tactics project, and it was a partnership between the Southern Maine Planning and Development Commission and the Wells Reserve, and we did a kind of sea level rise vulnerability assessment for I think it was 3 or 4 towns in southern Maine, and one of the ideas that we had was actually to send like a 1-pager along with the I don't know if it was like the annual tax assessment. I mean, that seems like a poor choice to send something about sea level rise along with your tax assessment. But not being a homeowner yet, I'm not sure what you would get in the mail from the municipality, but there was something that we were thinking of including in a mailing to go out to all of the homeowners, because we recognize, and from my experience working on my dissertation with community members in Wells, it is really apparent that a lot of people don't actually know the risk. They are experiencing the risk and they're seeing the change over time, but they don't necessarily know that the data exists, or where to find it or how to interpret it about, future sea level rise projections. So I think that that's something that is definitely on the minds of a lot of people working in like education and extension. The other thing I would say that I don't think that Maine does this, but I've heard of some other states who are starting to implement a flood disclosure as part of real estate programs. So if you are, taking out a mortgage and buying a home, then one of the things that would be shared with you by your real estate agent is a flood risk assessment, essentially. So that might be something that, Maine will want to consider.
Marty, I see your hand is up. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I tried to put it in chat, but it wasn't working. But anyway, I was wondering, is there a Lincoln County Emergency Management, and what do they do? And I was aware, like last winter, there was a real cold spell, and was Cassett Community Center was open up for a safe place, but I got that through an email because I'm a member of the Wiscasset Community Center. But how do other people find out about that availability? Is that part of the Lincoln County management, emergency management, or how does that work?
Amazing that one. Yep, so Lincoln County does have a very active emergency management agency, both at the county level, and then there's local emergency management agency representatives, if you will. So each town has a local, what they call EMA, emergency management agent. And so with that example of that really freezing cold snap in early February, I think it was, they were active the county was active in reaching out to communities, figuring out where the warming center was. I believe they were posting it on, Facebook, sending it to the local news stations who had kind of like that scrolling ticking bar on the bottom telling people what warming centers were open. And so they are playing an active role in terms of response to storms. So both, or any event like the cold snap in February, but also during, the rain event that we had recently. I think it was the beginning of May, where we had I think it was like 6 inches of rain in less than a 24-hour period. There was a lot of roads that washed out. And so in any of those storm events, the county EMA is coordinating with local EMA, fire departments, police departments, CMP in terms of restoring power to municipalities, letting CMP know where broken trees are, broken poles are, whether it's accessible or not. So they do a lot of that coordinating work during the storm response events. And then as far as their longer range planning, if you will, the county has to adopt and update every 5 years the county hazard mitigation plan. And so that involves a significant risk assessment, looking at past storms and then projecting out potential risk in the future, both from a dollar perspective, so calculating potential losses, as well as figuring out what hazards are most likely to impact Lincoln County, and what would that look like. And then each municipality, as part of that update, has to put together a list of projects in terms of hazard mitigation projects that they would like to undertake to hopefully mitigate some of those risks to each of those events, whether it's flooding, winter storms, drought, wildfires. And so that plan was updated most recently in 2021 and adopted in early 2022 by the county and all municipalities. And that's available. They have a pretty interactive website too, which I can actually put in the chat for you.
Yeah, the other concern is like, actually, I was feeling it the other day. I was supposed to mow the lawn. I was down in New Hampshire, and I was a little concerned about heat stroke, and I'm not sure if elderly people are aware of that possibility. With the heat getting hotter and hotter up here, people are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So it's education, but how do you reach out to a lot of people to make them aware of what's available? And
I have a question.
thank you for your comments, Emily.
Katie, do you want to ask your question, and then we'll get to you next?
I guess this question was originally for Jessica, but I feel like I can kind of throw it out to anybody. It's a kind of a big threefold question. But when you envision a resilient community, what do you see? How's that different from where we are now? And then how do we get there?
I was thinking about this question on the way over. And, I think one of the things to recognize, in addition to, we all might have a different definition of resilience that we're working with, but we also all probably have a very different vision of what resilience looks like for us. So for me personally, resilience would be, safe and affordable housing for everybody in places that are not at risk. It would be living wages for people, for doing not having to have 2 or 3 jobs in order to afford to live in a place. It would certainly, for me, be public transportation or walkability, because those are things that I personally really value. I would also, one of the reasons that I love Maine is just the ability to access nature. And so I think that, in spaces where we've done a lot of development on the coast, it might mean, letting some of that go back to nature so that it provides more of a buffer for inland communities, and also gets people out of risky places. So those are some of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking about my own personal, resilient future. But I would love to know what other people think about like what that looks like. I see a hand.
Walter?
Yes, I'm on the planning board of a local municipality, and I hope at some point fairly soon we're going to be grappling with a comprehensive plan. My question is, should resilience find its way into a comprehensive plan as a discrete area? And if so, what would be the dimensions of that?
That's a great question. I have an opinion, but I would defer to the planners in the room.
That is a great question, Wall, and we're starting to see more towns start to contemplate that, not just in Lincoln County, because I know, Bristol, who we have a comp plan member sitting in the audience here, they have started to contemplate how do you incorporate climate change and resilience into your plan, in your comp plan, even if it's just a light touch way in your goals and strategies that are for each individual chapter. So, transportation, natural resources, water resources. We've also heard, I think it's Phippsburg, right, is considering they're doing a comp plan update. Are you working on that too, Jess?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. And so they want to incorporate, I think in a larger way, climate change aspects and planning for the future. Because a comp plan, is your guidebook in a sense for the next 20, 30 years. I mean, I know we update it every 10, but you're looking on a very outward scale. And so it would be a disservice if you didn't consider it as part of your comp plan. It's part of planning for the future.
Yeah, and I would piggyback off that to say that, like, when I, again, thinking back to my own personal vision of resilience, but I think also kind of speaking to what I was sharing with you all, is that especially when we're thinking about social resilience, it is broad and very holistic of a bunch of different issues. It's not just about, the natural environment or the physical infrastructure. I personally think that it is more effective to weave resilience throughout all of the different chapters, because ultimately resilience, like if we are moving towards a resilient future, as I was saying, like it's about housing, it's about infrastructure, it's about open space, it's about jobs, it's about, potentially tourism, it's about the natural resource industry. So in some ways, I think rather than siloing it to say like, it's just this chapter that's about resilience, finding ways to weave it in throughout might be a more effective way.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. So we're talking, about managed retreat and hopefully people moving away, taking built space and converting it back to natural space. As part of that, you have to change human behaviors, and that can be tough. And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that. And I ask because I experienced Sandy. I was living on Long Island, and for the next literally 10 years, the news was talking about they would every Sandy anniversary they didn't interview people who were rebuilding their homes exactly where it was, and they're like, "This is my home. I'm not going to let a storm, take it away from me." And so there's that attachment that is human nature. And so how do you overcome that in a sense to start to look at it on the broader scale of it's safer for you to move back, even though we recognize, there is an attachment to the property?
Yeah. Oh man, if there was an easy answer to this question, all of the people at this conference last week would be so thrilled, because I feel like that was just every conversation in all of the different rooms was how it is context by context and place by place. So, on the one hand, you experienced people in Long Island saying, we're building back better. And then in places like Staten Island, you had people saying, we're done. We don't want to face this risk anymore. And we don't want other people to face this risk. So we want to be bought out, and we want this space to become nature. Like we want it to go back to a natural habitat so that nobody else faces the risk that we faced. So it's really context by context. One of the things that I heard last week though was that what might help a bit is that, telling people that they need to retreat away or they need to move away from places that are deeply meaningful and deeply special to them, and that, hold memories and connections to family members and, language and knowledge and culture. Telling people that they have to move away from something doesn't really give them a lot of options. But if you start to give them if you co-create a vision of what are we moving towards instead of what are we retreating away from, it can be, a bit of a more effective way to engage people in conversation about that. there was a couple of representatives from a project that had happened in Vancouver in British Columbia, and they had developed all these really beautiful kind of like schematics of what these places could look like in the future that were based on conversations that they had with the community members. So if like people are really, I mean, I honestly think part of it is that people have a threshold. We all have thresholds for risk and risk tolerance. And some people have a much higher risk tolerance. And so they will stay until there literally is no option, or until they're, you know, forced to leave, or worse, they are harmed. So there's not an easy answer. For me, I think it is creating spaces to have what are inherently very difficult conversations, and doing so in kind of, you know, a really empathetic way to show that like we understand, like this is not just a technocratic process. I understand that this is a deeply emotional connection for you. What is it that we can do, you know, to kind of foster that sense of place in a new place that you might be moving towards. But yeah, behavior change is a real tough nut to crack, especially in the US, where people are, you know, tend to be very kind of individualistic, and also very like, we're building back better. Yeah.
Thank you.
Walter?
Yeah, I have a sort of a related question. On the planning board, one of the most difficult and expensive kinds of projects we deal with are shoreline stabilization as a result of rising sea rays. I guess my question is that something to be encouraged, or should at some point just let nature take its course? What's the dividing line?
I don't know. I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, I think that, you know, again, it kind of comes down to people's risk tolerance, whether or not they're willing to stay in a place that they might have to face, you know, recurring hazards and recurring risks. Mm-hmm. I think some of it is going to be funding related, because, you know, we can continually put money into these responses that may work in the short term, but that ultimately are not protecting us in that longer term range. And it might just get to a point where it's like, we're kind of just throwing money away, because, you know, this might last for a year, but next year it's going to be gone. You know, I think it's similar with beach nourishment. You know, when we like dredge places and put extra sand on the beach, I mean, the coast is a very dynamic place. The coast has always changed over time. That's what people love about the coast, is it's constantly changing. Where we get into a tricky situation is it's no longer just short-term change, it's the longer-term change. So in some ways, these natural processes, like we don't have control over them. And so we do, I think, have to start, you know, doing an assessment of like, what are the thresholds? So for that example, you might say, we will do shoreline stabilization 3 times, you know, and if we reach that 3rd time, then we are going to shift to a different type of strategy. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that as planning folks?
No, I mean, I think you covered it really well. Nothing's jumping out of me that's any different than what you kind of alluded to.
Thank you.
Are you aware of any really comprehensive academic modeling that has gone on about the economic costs, all factors, economic costs of a given sea level rise, especially thinking about, you know, from Cape Hatteras north? A huge amount of value sits under likely inundated future levels of the sea. The cost isn't just the structures that would be impacted, but it's all of the business, social connectivity, the fabric of things that are now intertwined, where those links would be broken in the future, even early stage of significant inundation. Just take a look at what New York City is thinking of doing, and it's technically not going to work.
Are you talking about the seawall or the
Yeah.
levee system? Yeah.
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 To plug every possible way that water would come into at least the model that they put forward so far.
Yeah.
And even if that holds out for 30 years, okay, what then?
Mhm.
You've not built a long-term stable model.
Yeah. I am not aware of any large-scale academic study that is looking at the kind of economic impacts. I know that the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has done a lot on different aspects of the coastal economy, and so they might be a place where, you know, they would have some numbers associated with things that, like, not just, you know, the homes and the buildings, but also the businesses. I mean, in Maine, so much of our tourism is dependent on, you know, the beach and the coast. And if the beaches are underwater, that's going to be a lot of, you know, really important financial losses that we're facing. I do know that in the state, Rachel Bouvier has done a lot of work at kind of the municipal level. I know that she was part of the Tides, Taxes, and New Tactics project to kind of look at some of those economic indicators. I don't know if she's done, I think she's worked with Blue Hill, but I don't know what other communities in the kind of like mid-coast region she's worked with. She's done a lot with Southern Maine towns to say, you know, these are the jobs that might be at risk. This is the kind of industrial presence, the tourism dollars that might be lost at different scenarios, right? So like 1 foot, 3 feet, 6 feet, et cetera.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. What time are we at?
Oh, do we have any other questions right now? All right, for the sake of time, would you like to move on to resources and steps?
Definitely. I think it would be nice to end on a happier note to talk about what are the resources that are available.
Would you guys want to talk a little bit about SRP 1?
Yeah, sure.
Convenience too, as well. The funding's in place, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why not. I mean, well, I don't
We'll
think
start with
Kristen's- I don't think
SRP1.
Kristen's on right now. I'm just kidding.
We'll have the recording.
So, you know, Emily was already talking about the Community Resilience Partnerships Program, which is this really wonderful funding opportunity that's offered through the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. And that has really been doing a lot to help municipalities move forward in doing things like assessment, planning, greenhouse gas inventories, et cetera. So, you know, there are a lot of, I know that we just got a report today about how many communities have joined this program. So that's a really great resource and opportunity. But there is also a project that that is, we had the first phase of this project. It was called the Social Resilience Project. And it was a collaboration between Eileen Johnson at Bowdoin, who is really like at the forefront of thinking about social vulnerability in Maine. She worked with Blue Sky Planning, with the Wells Reserve, the Nature Conservancy, the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, lots and lots of different partners to pull together this project to explore social vulnerability in the context of kind of disaster and emergency management in the Bath, Brunswick, and kind of peninsular areas. So what they did was they did a kind of deep dive, community engaged project where they worked with these I think it was 7 or 8 different towns to get a sense of who are the different sectors in these communities that might be working with socially vulnerable populations, or whose work could benefit socially vulnerable populations. So they did things like interviews and focus groups and surveys with representatives from 4 different sectors, which were social service, emergency management, land conservation, like land trusts, and the municipal staff at the town level. And then from all of the information that they gathered from those folks about like how do you think about social vulnerability? How do you work with socially vulnerable populations? What are the types of challenges that you face in your work? What are the types of resources that you need? And what they did is they developed a kind of tabletop scenario exercise, right? That had all of this kind of weather and climate information. And the scenario was that there was a storm that took place in winter. And it cut off a lot of people who might be socially vulnerable because the roads were flooded or washed out. And what we did is we ran through kind of a time piece of the scenario. So like immediately after this storm, who are the people that we are most worried about and why? And who are the people that we can mobilize to help meet their needs? And what are the gaps that exist in making sure that people get the resources that they need? So the immediate response, and then we kind of fast forwarded for 6 months in advance to say, what does it look like now? How is recovery going? Are there newly socially vulnerable populations that have sprung up? How just generally how are people repairing and recovering and also kind of mitigating the risk for something like this to happen again. And from that exercise, we learned some key things, some key takeaways were, and I think that this speaks to the communication question about like, how do we know, if there's a cooling center or a warming center, et cetera. So one of the gaps that we identified was that communication is a real big issue, and that probably isn't a surprise to anybody. But communication across and in between and among all of the different organizations who are working together, but also communication out to the community, to the people who are socially vulnerable. So that was one of the things that we said, let's try to build some capacity around this. We also found out that collaboration is an area where we can help to build resilience. So making sure that these different sectors aren't siloed, that they're actually talking to each other and collaborating. And then also capacity is just always an issue for everybody working on pretty much any issue related to climate change. People don't have the time or the bandwidth or the financial resources that are necessary to make sure that that we're responding to these issues in a robust way. So thinking about like what are the funding opportunities that are coming down to maybe create a new staff position to help out with some of this response. So we are super excited. We did that in the Bath Brunswick area, and what we're going to do now is to take that model and adapt it and adopt it for Lincoln County. So that project is going to kick off in September, and we will. One of the exciting things about this project is we won't just be focused on coastal communities. We will be focused on coastal, inland, and island communities in Lincoln County. So thinking about an event that would impact people in probably very different ways, thinking about who would be socially vulnerable, what are the resources, what's the capacity that we need. And we're super excited to be partnering with all of the folks here at the table on that. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so I'll just say we are also really excited. Lincoln County Regional Planning Commission is going to be a partner at the table with Jess and Maine Sea Grant, Bowdoin College, Blue Sky Planning, Wells Reserve, and it's going to be, we're anticipating it's a 2-year process. There's a lot of kind of legwork at the beginning, and then we'll do this, creation of the tabletop exercise, actually doing the tabletop exercise and then doing the analysis following that as well. So you'll start to see updates beginning in the fall coming from our office and our newsletters, both interprets and then our monthly newsletter. And then we'll be reporting out as we progress.
Question about tabletop exercises. Sort of the war game question.
Mm-hmm.
What didn't you put in? How do you deal with what you don't know
Mm-hmm.
in a modeling exercise to stretch it out, because you can't know what you don't know, but
Right.
how do you put in elements that were not part of at least the announced plan to get people caught by surprise? How do you adapt now to something that you had not been thinking about?
That's an interesting question. Everybody did receive the kind of like scenario workbook in advance. I don't think everybody read it. So I think that there probably were people who were caught a little bit by surprise in responding to things. But one, actually, from the perspective of someone who is kind of observing, I would say the fact that we are engaging with people who know way more than we do about the situation on the ground, they were the ones who helped to bring in the knowledge and, you know, the, hey, this isn't something you had in the scenario, but this would happen in this place. And I think because we so intentionally bring in, you know, people who have lived experience and local knowledge and observations over time, they are the experts. And so we can only design it so far, but once we engage with them, they're really the ones who make it come alive.
So they are the ones that are bringing the black swans to the scene.
Yeah, a little bit. And that for us, that's really important because then we learn about, you know, what we as practitioners or planners or academics are missing.
And I think to clarify too, I believe, you know, SRP1 also, you had a whole advisory committee. So as this tabletop exercise was being formulated, it wasn't just, you know, a siloed group of researchers putting together a idea. It was informed by advisory partners from those different entities.
Yes,
correct?
Definitely. And also from the focus groups and the interviews that we had with representatives from those different sectors. But so we did include that as like that local knowledge and lived experience and expertise as much as possible. But it was also just bringing people together from so many different places where, you know, I don't know, in those kind of collaborative learning spaces, you start to come up with new ideas that anyone individually or any specialized group individually would not have come up with. So there's kind of, that's part of the beauty of collaborative learning spaces, is that things are coming up that you probably wouldn't have identified without each other. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any on Zoom.
All right.
I have one from somebody that's not with us today. My wife's working on a project involving Sears Island and Mac Point, and was interested in what your opinion might be about the value of creating a baykeeper for that area once development takes shape. So you might, whether you need one up front, whether you need a baykeeper approach that is responsive to what is going to be developed. And what is your experience? You noted that your involvement with the Casco Bay Estuary. What has been your experience with managing the bioenvironment, eelgrass or other elements of it?
That's a good question. So Casco Bay Estuary Partnership is different than Friends of Casco Bay, but we do work closely together. And the Casco Bay, the baykeeper for Casco Bay is part of the Friends of Casco Bay. Sorry, that was a lot of Casco Bay. We definitely do within the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership. We do a lot of habitat restoration and revitalization. I can't really speak to that because I'm still fairly new in that role that I haven't quite learned. But I will also just say that I only learned that there was a baykeeper, that like the position of a baykeeper existed, that was actually a job that somebody could have. I only learned about that recently, and I think it's fascinating that somebody has the job of being the voice and the advocate for the bay is fascinating to me. I think, you know, if you're looking at areas that are going to potentially be built up fairly rapidly, like having a baykeeper in place as early as possible to be the voice of, you know, the bay, to say, you know, these are the things that that will help keep the bay, you know, healthy and resilient and potentially revitalized is, I mean, I would say early and often advocate for that, but I truly am very new to the concept of baykeeper. I've heard of riverkeeper before, but not of baykeeper. And I honestly was like, that is the coolest job that I've ever heard of.
Are you applying?
I know that Ivy, who is the baykeeper for Casco Bay, has a legal background. So she's a lawyer, which is really interesting. And I think that probably makes a big difference when you're advocating on behalf of, you know, a water body.
Do you have the full name?
I can get it to you.
Thank you.
I know I don't think I'll pronounce it correctly if I try to wing it.
I guess I have one last question. Going back to your topic on social vulnerability.
Yeah.
And so I sat in on one social resilience project meeting when they were kind of going through the guidebook.
Oh, yeah.
And I read the guidebook.
Yeah.
And it mentioned that social resiliency and vulnerability was a new topic to a lot of the people that were participating in the tabletop exercise.
Mm-hmm.
I found that really interesting because as a part of my environmental science major, it's a requirement that we take a class that looks at climate change as a social issue. So these are topics that I've heard floated around a lot. I think people my age at least are pretty familiar with them. So I was curious, when you learned about this, came upon this, how it's changed since you've been working with it, anything like that?
Yeah. I appreciate this question, and I also think it's hilarious because it makes me feel very old. Partially because I'm thinking about like, oh yeah, when did I get into this? And actually, so yes, I do think that there has always been a small and maybe not as loud as they could be group of people who were social scientists who were advocating for like the human side or the human dimensions of climate change. But for a long period of time, it was much more focused on things like the natural environment and like different species and habitats and, you know, potentially the built environment. I started working, so I feel like I have always been a little bit out there when I've been talking about the things that I'm doing. I think people are always kind of like, you're doing what? But I started working on the social dimensions of climate change in like 2009. And that was, so when Obama came into office, that really catalyzed a lot of the work and the momentum that is happening on climate change, because for the 8 years prior to that, it had not really been a priority at the federal level, at least. So since that time, since like 2008, 2009, I have seen tremendous change. And even within the past like 4 or 5 years, I've seen a lot of change of people actually understanding the importance of the social dimensions and things like community engagement and, you know, participatory research and incorporating local and indigenous knowledge. Like these are things that are still in some ways relatively new to some climate scientists and other folks that are working in this area, but I think that increasingly and very rapidly, it's becoming more and more integrated into this work. But I can, like, when I started working on the issue of climate change education specifically, it was in 2012, and we were focused on the polar regions. So we were focused on Arctic and Antarctic. And we were having a real hard time moving people away from like, we need to use the polar bear as, you know, the symbol of climate change in the Arctic. And we were like, but what about all the people? What about all the people that live in the Arctic that like depend on that way of life and who, you know, have been in these places for time immemorial? Like they are important too. I think that it is even just based on my experience with this conference last week, there are a lot more people talking about the need for incorporating social science and having social scientists at the table to make sure that we're thinking about people. Because a lot of the time when we're thinking about vulnerability assessments, we're thinking about assets, right? We're thinking about roads, we're thinking of buildings, bridges, et cetera. But like people actually are our greatest assets. So we should be thinking about them too in these processes.
And engineers are not good at herding cats.
Engineers are really important to have at the table, and they have some very important specialized skills, but you know, like I can't do anything engineering related, but I can talk to you about the social science and the community engagement. That's why we have to build these kind of collaborative approaches. We're getting the full picture.
I'll also add that there is actually a major at Maine now that is human dimensions of climate change. So
Yeah.
I think the future for social resiliency is really bright.
Yes, I agree.
All right, do we have any last questions? All right, I'll close it off by saying thank you so much, everybody, for coming. This is a really great discussion. Thank you, Jessica, for taking the time to come and speak with everyone. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We'll continue to be putting out our monthly newsletter, Interprets. Please subscribe if you aren't, and if you're interested in any grant opportunities or workshops, we try our best to include ones that are relevant to our community members. So yeah, please subscribe, and thank you all for coming.